Good morning, everyone. Dear colleagues, dear guests, on behalf of the Institute for European Politics and the Institute for Democracy, Societas, Civilis in Skopje, I would like to warmly welcome you to our RESILIO-ACCESS data visualization launch event, which is titled The Data Behind Rule of Law and EU Enlargement. My name is Hegedüs, and I serve as Deputy Director at the Institute for European Politics. And it's both a pleasure and an honor for me to introduce today's keynote speaker and an old friend, John Morijn, Professor of Law and Politics at the University of Groningen and legal expert on the rule of law with GIZ Ukraine, as well as our panelists and moderator, Albrecht, Research Associate at the Institute for European Politics, Misha Popovikj, Program Director at the Institute for Democracy, Societas, Civilis, Skopje, and Maria Skóra, also Research Fellow at IEP. The RESILIO-ACCESS project, with the kind and generous support of the Stiftung Mercator, examines the resilience of the rule of law in EU accession countries and explores how EU enlargement policy can actually contribute to strengthening rule of law resilience. And with the drafting of Montenegro's accession treaty being just around the corner, and with the political changes in Hungary, hopefully all obstacles removed to the opening of accession negotiations under the cluster's fundamentals in the case of Ukraine and Moldova, EU accession policy is once again entering a new phase in which, from an analytical perspective, assessing the rule of law performance of candidate countries and soberly evaluating the effectiveness of the EU rule of law toolkit gain particular importance. They are very relevant not only for informing the accession process itself, like in the case of Ukraine and Moldova, but also for supporting the design of effective post-accession conditionality mechanisms for future member states, and Montenegro particularly. And against this background, we are particularly delighted to present the data and data visualization toolkit of RESILIO-ACCESS, which we hope will contribute to the future work of many colleagues focusing on the interconnected issues of the rule of law resilience and EU accession. And before I would pass over the floor, just a couple of sentences about the housekeeping rules. We will start with the keynote of Professor Morijn, followed by a moderated panel discussion about the project's key takeaways and the introduction of the data visualization tool. You are welcome to submit your questions anytime using the Q&A function of Zoom, and we will do our best to incorporate your questions into the discussion. And I also would like to remind you that the event is being recorded and will be made available online at the YouTube channel of IEP. And having said that, I would like to pass over the moderation to Maria Skóra and also kindly ask Professor John Morijn to deliver his keynote speech. Thank you.
Thanks for having me and for having a pizza with me for breakfast. It's very nice to work with IEP again, because I am aware of the predecessor of this project, RESILIO, and it's one of the very few methods that I knew had actual policy traction in the policy circle in Brussels. So this is rare, and it's absolutely wonderful. And I can speak also on behalf of the GIZ in this regard, that this is now being extended to EU accession. I will use my short remarks to reflect on the use or the uses of RESILIO-ACCESS, this new project, and how that can concretely help EU accession work. I'll do this on the basis, next slide, Constanze, of two pizzas. One pizza is the EU accession acquis pizza that is very well known to everybody who works on EU accession affairs. It's the full acquis. I have lifted out here the fundamentals acquis. I'll talk about that a little bit further. And you also see on the right-hand side the methodology of the RESILIO-ACCESS that I'm sure will be presented in more detail later. My topic here is how these two pizzas are going to be connected, and I'll do that next slide in the following way. First, I'll talk a little bit about the work of GIZ Ukraine and the 3E4U work. I'll explain to you very briefly what that is and how I am involved in that. And then I have 3 questions about the 2 pizzas that I've just shown you. Where do their slices overlap? Is every ingredient equally important, or what needs prioritization? And the way that that RESILIO-ACCESS can help in that regard. And I also want to talk very specifically about one accession state, Ukraine, and the specific inspiration as well as challenges that presents us with in regard of resilience measurement. Next slide, you see the work that GIZ does in Ukraine. It's called 3E, so expertise, experience, and exchange, offered by essentially the largest member states of the European Union, Germany, to Ukraine. Started in January 2024, and I can tell you already that it is being extended until late next year. That will soon be announced. And this means that it's a very important foreign policy objective for the EU's biggest member state. So this is why it's particularly welcome to have every input that we can get. So how does this look in practice? You see that on the next slide. People like me, and I'm involved in this project as the lead rule of law expert, go to Kiev and speak to various different stakeholders. You see me here on the upper left corner giving a talk to the National School of Judges. I think I must have now given talks to over 300 judges. I have trained people from the Ombuds office. You see that on the bottom, as well as various people from ministries. I don't show these pictures in a way to say, how can I make this about me at all? What the purpose of these pictures really is that it shows that we work at 3E for you in ways to try and make this as relevant as possible for our Ukrainian partners, and also get an in-person sense of what is and is not actually important on the ground, which will be the focus of the remaining 10 minutes of my talk, because then we return to the pizzas. Where are the rule of law resilience elements in these pizzas? I've already briefly mentioned that it's mainly in the fundamentals chapters of the EU accession negotiations, which are these 8, as you can see, and I will soon focus on 2 of these, chapter 23 and what is called FDI, functioning of democratic institutions, and of course the RESILIO-ACCESS picture on the right is totally dealing with rule of law resilience. But let me just focus now, and you see this on the next slide, what is actually in these resilience, these rule of law chapters of the EU accession pizza, so to say. In chapter 23, there's various different elements. You see judiciary, you see anti-corruption, and you see fundamental rights. And this already immediately raises the question, as you can imagine, on the ground, and I've witnessed this on the ground. I was in Kiev several times last year. Where do we start? It's so much. All of these EU acquis elements are equally binding, need to be implemented, but where do you then actually start with, and what is the relative importance in that? I'll come back to that in a second. There's also another chapter in the fundamentals you see on the next slide, which is the functioning of democratic institutions, which deals with free and fair elections, with media freedom, and with what is called the well-functioning parliamentary procedure. The point for the EU to focus on this is that in order to guarantee that EU accession remains a legitimate target in the country that wants to accede, of course, Parliament needs to be at all times, national Parliament needs to be at all times be involved, and therefore the EU insists under this chapter on very close parliamentary involvement. Now, this is, I've indicated this in green, the previous chapter in yellow. If we then put that on top of our RESILIO-ACCESS pizza, you see that on the next slide, you see here that the RESILIO-ACCESS pizza that will be presented shortly has some green elements, so functioning of democratic institutions elements, for example, government censorship, unbiased media, electoral democracy, open government, public deliberation. So this is already in the EU's focus, but you see also some of the yellow chapter 23 elements in this approach by the IUP. and they are sort of spread out. So my observations here are the added value of the RESILIO-ACCESS model is that it shows the connections of what is already in the EU pizza, but it also shows how they hang together. I think it puts in sharper relief the overlaps between the different chapters, and this may sound theoretically obvious, but in reality, you'll see that in a member state like Ukraine, which I know, a future member state like Ukraine, which I know best, of course, different actors are responsible for different accession chapters, and they don't necessarily cooperate naturally. So this model is very helpful to make the broader point that all of these things hang together. I would note here that it's not immediately clear how the RESILIO-ACCESS model relates to other methods that are also widely in use. For example, the new Council of Europe, Venice Commission rule of law checklist. Is this fully overlapping with the RESILIO-ACCESS model, or is it complementary? In any event, and then we'll move to the most important part, when you design a strategy to accede to the European Union, how do you know what is the most important and where do you start? And this is the topic of this element of my presentation, because I want to share with you some secrets from the EU accession kitchen, the pizza oven. And there are three secrets that may not be so obvious from the outside. At least they were not obvious to me when I started working on this, but I think they're very important. So the first is that some EU accession pizza ingredients are simply more important to the EU than others. So they're not, even if there's a long list, some are more important than others. Some issues need addressing before others, before even progress can be made on others. I'll show you why that is. And some ingredients are sort of EU accession state specific. So even if there's now various different European states who want to become a member of the European Union, they will not face the same kind of scrutiny on the side of the European Union based on political realities on the ground. So I'm going to talk about each of these elements. The first is that what is actually the most important element to the European Union? I think there's three. If you sort of take a more general view of these rule of law resilience elements, the first are institutional issues. The European Union will be absolutely razor focused on independence and impartiality of key institutions for rule of law resilience, including on the appointment and the system and the non-interference in proceedings of that. Think about the judiciary, prosecution services, anti-corruption agencies, as we know well from the Ukrainian experience, national human rights institutions, data protection agencies. The reason is that if you are going to be a member of the European Union one day, the European Union is going to have to rely very strongly on the institutional architecture in your future member state. So that's why this is a key focus. There are some individual substantive issues that will be top of mind, including anti-corruption, so the criminalization and the prosecution of it, as well as the media freedom. For the case of Ukraine, what's very important is focus on private ownership and the fragmentation of the media landscape. And there, the European Union will not be satisfied just with reforms on paper, but you need to prove progress in practice. So you need to show a record of actually implementing these issues well. And then there's a couple of cross-cutting themes, for example, non-discrimination and data protection. So how do we know this? How do we know this secret from the kitchen? We know this from developments within the European Union itself. There's recent developments that basically link whether you can get any cash from EU funds to rule of law requirements, including specifically judicial independence and fighting corruption. We know that this is also the logic that the Commission imposes on current EU member states. You can see that, for example, in the 4 chapters by which it structures its annual rule of law report. And it's also now evidenced in agreed benchmarks for Ukraine with regard to Chapter 23. So these are simply the key issues, the most important issues there. So how does this look? You can see this on the next slide. On the RESILIO-ACCESS pizza, it's a bit like a salami pizza. If you order that, and I've lived for a long time in Italy, of course you're gonna first eat the salami, all the salami slices of the pizza before you start the rest of the pizza. It's a bit like that also with the Resilio-ACCESS. There are simply some issues here that are going to be more important for the European Union to focus on in this model, like judicial independence, fighting corruption, and media. So some of the data that will come out of this project will be more top of mind to EU policymakers than others. So this is sort of the heat map of the realities of EU accession. And then the last element of this, maybe a little less known, but it's nonetheless extremely important. Some issues are likely not so generalizable across the different European states that want to become a member of the European Union. They are country specific. So for Ukraine, for example, the national minority issue, the Hungarian minority issue will be top of mind simply because there's the Hungary as a member state that has made a big issue of this, at least during the previous government. So these all also need to be dealt with, even if they're sort of smaller issues in the bigger picture. But don't forget that EU accession remains a unanimity file, and therefore each of these elements will have to be dealt with, even if you're on a very tight timeline. And then the very last part, which is specific to Ukraine, but nonetheless extremely important. The Resilio-ACCESS model already in the lower left corner mentions state of emergency. And there is a state of emergency evidently in Ukraine that has a direct implication on the way that you can make headway with rule of law issues. Because a state of emergency means that you cannot organize elections. You cannot have full media freedom. There's no free movement of persons. There's a curfew, for example, at night. And there's simply no full control over the full territory. So that means that there's no way to start with even some elements of the Chapter 23 and the function of democratic institutions, which of course makes it harder to immediately implement all the findings of Resilio-ACCESS to the specific case of Ukraine, but it just highlights the importance of one of the elements in your pizza, the state of emergency and the fallback that it has. But it also has another element to this. You can see that on the next slide, which is that if you think about resilience and rule of law resilience in the specific case of Ukraine, I think that you cannot just look at the fundamentals chapter, but you need to also perhaps look at another chapter, some other slices of the EU pizza, which deal with external relations and specifically common foreign and security policy. Because the question that is now hanging in the air, sort of like the elephant in the room, is will common foreign security policy, chapter 31, actually become kind of a pre or a super fundamentals accession chapter in the case of Ukraine, because Ukrainian security and Ukrainian foreign policy will be of direct relevance to our own security. So how central will CFSP considerations become in support for or opposition to Ukrainian accession from existing EU member state? That's an open question. Because it's an unprecedented situation that we have. But I want to end on a more personal note. I have every confidence that Ukrainians and the Ukrainians that I've met myself are up to it. Why? Because I've spent quite a few weeks there, and one of the most extraordinary moments of my life was after 2 days of teaching staff of the Ukrainian Ombuds office, this gentleman that you see here pictured, who had just been doing his tour of duty. After the age of 60, you can resign from the army. And after my talk, he presented me with the badge of his own army unit, the 127th, and that is actually located in Kharkiv, his chevron. And he told me, John, you have to realize that the kind of thing that you are working on, the kind of thing that Resilio-ACCESS is now trying to put in the arena for us, is an inspiration and an aspiration to really deliver on making Ukraine free again, and that's what I want to leave you with. What we're talking about here is not just breakfast pizzas, but it's super important for many Ukrainians, and their fight for resilience is inspirational, just in the way that the way that Resilio-ACCESS gives us input is inspirational for us too. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, John, for your kind words about the project and for your not only expertise but also personal touch on the topic. That's great. I think you tackled the appetite for more in this debate, and we will satisfy this hunger. I would like to now invite my two colleagues to join our conversation after hearing your keynote. Jörg Albrecht from Institut für Europäische Politik and Misha Popovikj from the Institute for Democracy, Societas, Civilis. And Jörg, I would like to start with you to sort of set the scene and connect a little bit more. John was already mentioning our RESILIO-ACCESS model, but please introduce it in a bit more detail. What is the topic and the scope, and what is the purpose of this project, to sort of explain the context in which we're moving, and please do it in 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Maria, and good morning from my side. It's a pleasure to talk about RESILIO-ACCESS, and thank you also, John, for your thought, and may I also say appetite-provoking keynote. I will now introduce our RESILIO-ACCESS project a bit and leave you with a bit of food for thought on the prioritization also ongoing in the project, and I will promise that I will stop here with all the food metaphors. That's it for now. And as John showed, on the side of the EU, there's a high demand for building resilient institutions in EU accession candidates, but also in existing EU member states. And in that sense, I would say that EU accession policy is also influenced by the experiences within the EU in the past decade. So democratic backsliding, erosion of the rule of law plays a huge role also in the future design of EU accession policy. And as mentioned by Daniel Hegedüs earlier, in the design of post-accession mechanisms of conditionality when it comes, for example, to the accession treaty of Montenegro. So in other words, if I may say so, the EU does not want another Poland or Hungary. And this also features prominently in Montenegro's accession treaty design, and it will most likely include some form of rule of law and political safeguards. And we in the project are thus interested in the institutional side of how to build resilient institutions in the EU and in future EU member states. But we go beyond that. And we also assess beyond the status quo of assessing the state of resilience in EU aspirants, the institutional and structural factors that make the rule of law resilient, but also the more, how we call it, social environment, the capacity of the rule of law to withstand stressors if they appear. And we can again connect this to also the experiences of Ukrainians, especially when it comes to Ukrainian civil society that under wartime conditions in the last year showed significant resilience when it also came to political events in the so-called July events and anti-corruption frameworks. We can also maybe connect this to the political change that we have seen in Hungary, which would have not been possible without the independence of journalists, without their fight for independence, without the resilience of civil society. And in that regard, the EU also relies on these gatekeepers, on these information providers in its reporting on the situation of the rule of law on the ground. So this is also an objective of our project, to understand not only the institutional and structural factors, but also the more social environment. And lastly, we are also interested in how the EU accession process can promote resilient institutions beyond institutions themselves and sustain them in the long term, because that is also the experience of backsliding that we have seen in the EU for the past 15 years. So we will also make suggestions on how to make resilience building more effective and how to target EU investments more strategically. Next slide, please, Constanze, and I will just give you a short outlook of what we have in stock, what is cooking in the kitchen in this year. So we published the RESILIO-ACCESS model, which relies on 3 layers: the institutional dimension, the social dimension, and the threats. And we also published already snapshots that explain our model better, to understand you better. So I hint you towards that. And now we are very proud to to really publish the RESILIO-ACCESS Monitor, a data visualization that will be introduced later in this talk. And I want to hint you towards the 9 country reports we will have this year. We have insights on EU-Turkey relations and the rule of law, and of course a full study that is published by the end of the year, where we go into depths about our data analysis. And finally, we will also have a final conference in Brussels connecting our research findings with stakeholders at the EU level. And before closing, I just invite you to stay in touch with us, engage with us and these projects and outcomes that are provided by the Institute for Democracy and us together. And we are very happy to stay in touch with you, and I will leave it at that. Thank you so much for this moment.
Thank you very much, Jörg. So this is where we are in the project, and this is what the project is all about. And I would now like to move to Misha, who is the key person behind data analysis. He plays the pivotal role in actually collecting, analyzing, and processing the data. So Misha, what the data say so far? We've collected it from different open sources to feed the model with empirical evidence. Would you be so kind as to present 5 conclusions from this preliminary data analysis, and also in 5 minutes? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Maria. Yeah, well, first of all, a little bit of context. So these data are data that should always be seen in relation to values or results that should be compared to the EU member states at some point in time. So the EU member states and the EU average, we treat it as a sort of a benchmark in the analysis. And given that, we see like 4 clusters of results when we look at the performance of the rule of law capacity. This is one of the measures that we took, and that you will later on have the ability to browse through. So one, let's say, cluster is the low performers, and this is basically Turkey as one of the outliers in this sense. But then there is Ukraine and 5 countries of the Western Balkans, which is 5 countries, so Western Balkans minus Montenegro, I would say. And then we have Moldova as a 3rd cluster, and then Montenegro and Georgia's top performance in rule of law capacity. But when we were looking into what contributes or what measures contribute most to how these countries are ranked, we were looking into the contribution of the different resources that countries have available and that we took in the model. And what differentiates countries most within the group is absence of corruption and regulatory enforcement. So the ability of these countries to control corruption and to successfully enforce laws are the 2 most important resources for the countries that we are looking now. And basically, what we have found is that Montenegro and Georgia have have these resources most like the EU average. So the profile of how these different aspects of a rule of law capacity are constructed, we see these variables as most important. But we also have to consider 2 more resources, and that these are the ability of the judicial systems to have effective criminal justice and civil justice. So this shows us that these four aspects are actually the most important part of when we imagine a successful rule of law. That is that there is a lack of or there is controlled corruption. Then the laws are enforced, so there is implementation of rules. That, but also the two, let's say, aspects of rule of law, and that is to have a successful criminal justice system, but also provide opportunities for citizens and businesses to be protected by the law, are the most important part when we construct and mostly contribute to the scores of primary rule of law resilience and subsequently to the rule of law capacity. When we are looking into the subsidiary resilience, or what Jörg said and described as social environment, here we see that electoral democracy and academic freedom emerge as the most significant contributors. So these scores are low in comparison to EU member states. So they are bringing the composite scores down. But these are the resources that we should focus on when we are looking into what should be the actions of the development of these countries when we are looking into the how to help these countries move forward. One, I would say, important part is to look at, for instance, how these variables contribute to the scores. For instance, for Turkey, roughly 70% of the subsidiary resilience or the social environment has been contributed by the very low scores on electoral democracy and academic freedom. And conversely, Montenegro, the top performer, has very, very good scores in academic freedom and unbiased media. And this is how this is the reason why the social environment there is conducive into how Montenegro is ranked. And what you're looking at on the screen, this is probably the most important finding of the analysis, is that when we model the effect of the social environment to the primary resilience, to the institutional environment, we see what would be the expected values of rule of law when we factor in the social environment, when we factor in the democratic infrastructure. And this is where we start looking into countries that overperform and countries that underperform. What this means is that given the availability of the democratic infrastructure, if the rule of law, if the primary resources are what we expect the primary resources to be, if the observed primary resources are higher, then this means that the rule of law overperforms. If we are looking into what, if we are expecting higher results, but actually the observed rule of law, the primary resilience aspect dimension of the rule of law capacity is under what is expected, that this means that rule of law underperforms. And we see that Moldova, Kosovo, and Georgia are actually overperforming given what is expected with the state of democracy in these countries. And this is probably what we should focus on in the future in trying to develop further analysis on rule of law and the contribution that the democratic environment gives to the rule of law. I think my time is up, so I'll stop here and then I'll join in after in the discussion.
Thank you very much, Misha, for giving us the highlight of the results, the preliminary results. And I would actually still stay with you because we have some questions in the Q&A round. And this would also be a question that I wanted to ask you about some striking results. For example, Georgia, scoring relatively high, in Turkey relatively low. So we should, I think, also mention to the participants that the data come from 2024, so it does not cover the events that has occurred in the last 24 months. But Jelena Pejnikic asked, Georgia is ranked second with grade. This is surprising, as I would assess situation there worse than Serbia. Would you explain why these results might seem counterintuitive sometimes?
Yeah, thank you for the question. The data that we have gathered comes from all the way from 2014 up to 2024. So it cannot account for the latest developments. But also, what I would say is that if we are talking about rule of law, and especially if we are talking about rule of law resilience, then we are talking about a process that takes time to develop. And resilience should be also, like in a very simplistic terms, seen as sort of elasticity of a particular system to be to accommodate to some change. And what is actually, so basically the results you're seeing are for 2024, but they are constructed with all data from 2014 to 2024. So the model sort of is informed with all this historic data. And Georgia has a really good head start if we are looking the data points that come from 2014 up to 2024. But even in 2025, which is not factored into this analysis, the 2025 data for the World Justice Project, Georgia is still above the countries in focus. I would say in terms of rule of law, still higher than some EU member states. I mean, 2 EU member states. This kind of shows 2 things: this elasticity of the system to be able to sort of observe some of the negative effects that occur occasionally. But I'm sure that when we continue doing this exercise in the years to come, the negative changes in Georgia that are occurring now or have occurred in the recent period will have an effect on the result. It's just not in this term.
Excellent, Misha. Thank you so much for your answer. And I would like to go back to John and York. John, the first reactions to what Misha has said, and also there is a question for you in the question Q&A section. The rule of law is very as a broad concept, but the EU focuses on only on certain aspects, as you presented. And what are the consequences of this focus? Some of them overlap with our model. But would you combine these two? So what is surprising in the early results of our model, and what do you think are the consequences of focusing or including or overly stressing the institutional resources and maybe neglecting the more softer democratic ones in the assessment towards the enlargement process?
Yeah, so thanks a lot for these questions and also for the presentation, Misha and Jörg. Let me start with taking the second first. I think that what's very important in what Jörg and Misha present is that we're talking about the package deal. You cannot have one without the other, and you cannot really think usefully about the subsidiary elements without the institutional side to it. And to some extent, I think that your model actually shows that there are certain limits, and I'm choosing my words carefully here. Of course, I'm in an official role, to the very institutional focus of the European Union and the way that it prioritizes things. Because if things hang together, of course you have to start somewhere, but there's also a certain limit on having an overly institutional focus. And I think that the way that Jörg presented the actual rationality of this project, in that you want to avoid that you have future Hungaries and Polands in your European Union. Actually, Hungary and Poland are now also excellent laboratories of how the dynamic on the ground can really change. Because if we now look at Hungary, we were all super worried, and by we I mean people who looked carefully about this, about institutional capture. Well, actually change happened in the social area and in the media area. And to some extent it was the same in Poland. So if you want to learn lessons, and this also connects partly to what Susan was asking me, I think that you might want to wonder whether such a purely institutional focus, or starting purely and only with institutions, is really the lesson to be drawn. I'm putting it very diplomatically here, but you will hear my lesson. You will hear my point. One of the things that is also interesting in my experience is even the institutional focus of the European Union is sometimes a little bit one-sided. For example, to give you one example that I find very important, in the functioning on democratic institutions chapter, I have explained that it's important for the European Union that national parliaments are well informed. So it's very specific focus on just one role of a national parliament. But what is not focused on is that a national parliament is also a co-legislator. So therefore also a co-responsible for actually hitting the target of getting the whole acquis implemented. What we often see, particularly in the context of Ukraine, is that there's many different times that the national parliament actually proposes legislation as a co-legislator that directly goes against the target to be met as a matter of meeting EU accession targets. So that's the general part of my answer. Specifically to Susan, what I was talking about is the prioritization of the European Union, that it focuses on some elements at the expense, perhaps first, of others. But the logic of meeting the whole EU acquis is that you need to meet all the targets in the whole pizza. So it doesn't mean that if you start with something that you will not have to do something else, but there's a certain logic that you have to start there, because if you do not have that in a solid basis present, you will not be able to make any headway with any of the other elements. And then to the final element, what was surprising to the findings, I'd have to look at it a little bit more carefully, but I find it very interesting that to some extent, for the country that I know well, Ukraine, I find it surprising that they're sort of in the middle of the pack already to some of the findings that Misha has, which goes to show that, in combination with the resilience that I've actually ended my own presentation on, and I'm really quite confident with that. If one day soon this aggression will actually be over, given the social energy that is actually present within Ukraine, that it can meet these targets relatively quickly.
Thank you very much, John. And Jörg, briefly, what is surprising to you? And what do you think? Are you surprised that some resources play a bigger role than others? Were your expectations different or the same?
Maybe I can connect this to something that Misha presented, which is academic freedom, which obviously as an academic is important to me myself. But I was really surprised that, especially in the case of Montenegro, academic freedom plays a huge role in improving the capacity. So what we can see here, and I think this is also connected to the point that John was making, really is the social dimension of what sustains resilience, and let's put it like the normative underpinning of sustainable and elastic institutions. So in that regard, maybe we can see academic freedom also as a kind of proxy of the healthiness of a normative and functioning, well-functioning civic space, because it is connected to the freedom of speech. It is connected to the freedom of association. And obviously, with universities, states have a lot of control about the university sector, about funding, etc. And a healthy civic space where academic ideas can flourish and can be exchanged freely seems to me an important underpinning of the healthiness of resilient institutions and resilient social embeddedness of institutional resilience in that regard.
Thank you so much, Jörg. Misha, you wanted to quickly react.
Yeah, because I was answering the Georgia question, I actually didn't answer your question. What were the surprising findings, and they relate to what John and Jörg were just saying.
And there is a question about that from Maria Mirczewska. What are the surprisingly not contributing or contributing factors? So if you could wrap it up.
Yeah,
also.
What emerges here is that I think the slight pivot of how EU sees reforms is kind of reflected in what the findings are telling us, and that is that what contributes most are concepts that are best measured by performance rather than capacity or resources. So when we are talking about academic freedom, I mean, at the University of and at the School of Law, that's where they teach judges and lawyers and public and future public prosecutors. If these schools are dependent on politics, or if they are intentionally being, let's say, low performers, then what is to be expected about the future delivery of justice and also regulatory enforcement? I mean, this is a performance concept in essence, and I think this is where and this is where we can look at actually linking progress and evaluation of progress of the countries with what actually delivers. And let me give you an example of two findings that are linked with this. This is one of the findings is that a judicial budget is not a really good predictor of the result. This is not to say that the judicial budget is not important, but the effects of a lacking or not lacking judicial budget are seen in the other concept. So as a measurement, maybe it's not the best, but you see the effects in regulatory enforcement, in the quality of justice. Similarly, civil society. We know civil society is very important. We don't need RESILIO-ACCESS model to tell us this. But here we see that actually civil society as a measurement does not really help in explaining the difference of the countries, the scores, because we already see the effects of civil society elsewhere, in electoral democracy, and the quality of electoral democracy mostly. And particularly because for civil society, it's a very difficult concept to put in a particular place, because civil society can perform well even in very dire circumstances and contribute to some positive effects. So the measurement of the state of civil society can be very bad, but the contribution of civil society is seen elsewhere. So this is why I think the performance side of understanding how countries progress is a very important perspective for the EU institutions when they evaluate the progress of the countries.
Yeah, I hope this explanation of Misha also refers a little bit to the question asked by Inida Metoksa from the West Balkans perspective. What are the biggest gaps between former reforms and the actual implementation? This is not exactly what we were measuring in this project. However, you can see, of course, the differences in at the declarative level and the practical level. And John was also mentioning it with the governments meeting requirements and introducing legislative changes and how they actually fit the requirements for enlargement. So I hope it somewhat feeds into your question, but it's not exactly what we were looking in the project. However, looking at the time, we are inevitably coming to an end of our breakfast briefing, 1 hour energetic breakfast briefing. And I would like to finish it with actually showing you or explaining the visualization that we prepared and what you can actually do with the tool that from this morning is online. So this is, the occasion why we gathered today. So first, a few disclaimers. Misha has already mentioned it, but I'll say it again. This data is for 2024 or earlier when applicable, for example, to the rule of law history. So please mind the changes in political developments occurring in the last 24 months are not reflected. Second of all, remember, we are not measuring the rule of law, the state of the rule of law, but its capacity and performance. So the potential to defend itself, the stock of the rule of law. Hence, some results might seem counterintuitive, but they refer to resilience, not the rule of law itself. You can also see that we have 2 countries on the map, like Ukraine. And here, please consider that these results are in this light of Russia's full-scale invasion and resulting in a state of emergency in the country. I think John made it already very clear. And Kosovo, this designation is without prejudice to positions on the status of Kosovo and its declaration of independence. The country is also included in our analysis of EU accession candidates. And Constanzo was so kind as to already show you the first dashboard, the dashboard cord overview in which you will basically be able to see the ranking, the map, and the panel on the left presents scores for different dimensions of rule of law resilience, primary, subsidiary resilience, as well as stressors. They refer directly to the model that Jörg was explaining. The rule of law capacity stands for the combined primary and subsidiary resilience, and stressors were calculated together as an aggregate. And this view you can change between selected countries or the overall average scores. And the index value are on the scale from 0 to 1, with 0 is the lowest and 1 is the highest. And you can also see the percentage contribution of each resource on the left. So you can see how resources, single resources, contribute to the overall resilience type and the total index value, how much, how's their strength, how much they pull it down or up, but not in which direction. This is important to highlight. This is not how the percentage stands, not how strong the civil society, for example, is, or academic freedom. No, it shows how much they contribute to the aggregated resilience, be it subsidiary or primary. So the second dashboard is called correlations. And here you can see the interplay. They are scatter plots presenting the performance of the rule of law resilience per country. And it is expressed as correlations between types of resilience, resilience capacity, or single resilience resources when correlating with stressors, when confronted with stressors. You can also see the EU average here for comparison. So the first graph shows bundled resilience types, the composite resilience type and resilience capacity, and scatterplot presents each specific resilience factor, resilience resource, sorry. And here you can also see the values for each resilience resources. So you can see how strong or weak they are per country. The dots are on the map are, of course, presenting the country view. And last but not least, you have a third dashboard in this visualization called projections. And I'd like to explain it as sort of investment output. So this dashboard shows dumbbell plots. They present the potential change in rule of law resilience induced by improving rule of law resources in selected countries. So the first dumbbell graph presents the projected improvement of primary resilience, so the very core of our model, if each country would close 50% of its gap towards EU 27 average. So as Misha said, we always refer it to the EU 27. And graph 2 shows how much the overall rule of law capacity would improve per each country if each country closes 50% of its gap across all subsidiary resources. So to sort of say how these democratic resources would pull rule of law capacity if improved 50% compared to EU 27. That answers the last question in our Q&A. If the model also includes member states, to some extent, the visualization, however, only focus on the EU accession candidates. So please check it out. Constanza will put the link in the chat. The visualization is now also available on our website. Please mind, it still might be subject to improvements and tweaks and changes, but you can already play with it now. And for now, the last thing I have to do is thank you very much for joining us this Wednesday morning to hear out about our project and see our visualization. Thank you very much for the speakers, John, Jörg, and Misha. Thank you for the Stiftung Mercator for supporting this project, and thank you very much for the EAP team for putting up this event. Should you have any questions, please reach out to Jörg regarding the project, or if you would like to know more about data, please reach out to Misha. And a heads up, there are more upcoming events in the coming months in the project. So Civil Society Forum in Ohrid in June, and also country reports. So stay in touch and follow us for further outputs. And yeah, that's it for now. Have a good day and see you at the next RESILIO-ACCESS events.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.